We have two extraordinary guests, and I'm really happy that we have them tonight. And we will discuss a very important topic. How do populists mobilize memory? We will get some examples from Poland and from Serbia. We will start with our first speaker, Dariusz Stola, and his talk focusing on Polish memory politics and policies, and then go to Jelena Đureinović, who will speak about this topic and give us insights to the Serbian discourse. Afterwards, we will have a short discussion here, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So make notes, remember your questions. There will be enough space and time that we can discuss that, because this transformative salon is not only for us, this is a lot for the public. So I want to introduce our first speaker. Dariusz Stola is a historian, professor at the Institute for Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has researched Poland's political and social history in the 20th century, particularly Polish-Jewish relations, international migrations, and the communist regime, as well as the memory of this past. He has authored numerous articles and books, including Kraj bez wyjścia, Migracje z Polski, 1949 do 1989, Migrations from Poland, 1949 to 1989. I think this is a book that almost everyone from us know. I mean, if you somehow have something to do with migration studies, you will have to know it. Another publication would be Kampania antysyjonistyczna w Polsce 1967 do 1968, the anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, or Nadzieja i zagłada, Hope and the Holocaust. In 2014 to 2019, he was the director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, and this is also one of the reasons why he is so well known. Dariusz Stola, we are very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being invited to this place. I appreciate the center and also this relaxed atmosphere of having the seminar here. Especially, it's not usual that my audience can drink beer at the same time, and I can drink beer in a presentation. I should make it a new tradition in Poland too. So a few words of disclosure. I am a simple historian who happened to become a public historian and then happened to become an actor in a war about the past, in a public conflict about the understanding of the past. So I was somehow forced to the topic I'm going to speak today of. Most of the people who work in memory studies are either sociologists or anthropologists, or those who work on the policies on the past. They are mostly political scientists. So I have a peculiar perspective, which is also that I try to explain what's happening by the genealogy of the present, and especially the genealogy of the most recent history of it. And I would like to turn your attention to a particular feature of the Polish Populist Party, the party Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, Law and Justice, of Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński, who is an unquestionable leader, especially since his twin brother died in a plane crash 13 years ago. That an important part of the program and practice are policies related to the past, and in particular, policies related to shaping how people imagine the past, understand and evaluate the past. So this is what I called memory policies. In Poland, until recently, it had the name of polityka historyczna, which is history policy. Polish doesn't differentiate between politics and policy. It's the same word, polityka. Which is a little problem, but I will distinguish between the two. And this insistence on the memory policy or policy on the past is a special feature of the Polish Populist Party. It certainly stands out among other Polish parties and among most of other populist parties, the insistence of the past. And I was trying to understand why it is so, and also why is it effective? Because it seems to be effective. And this I understood many years ago, thanks to a book by Michael Barnard and Jan Kubik about the 2009 celebrations of the 20th anniversary of the peaceful revolutions of 1989. You may know the book, where they found that there is a pattern of actors, political actors dealing with the past. And there was a smallest group among those actors. There were those who were abnegators, who didn't want to go into the past. There were liberal pluralist politicians who were happy with having a variety of ideas about the past, including about 1989, the key date in recent history of Eastern Europe. But there was a small group of politicians whom Bernard and Kubik called mnemonic warriors. People who deliberately incited conflicts, were breaking apart consensuses about the past to have a conflict about the past. And it was a small group consisting basically of two men, Mr. Orban and Mr. Kaczynski. So this is what unites them, a very active and divisive memory policy and the fact that they remain in charge. So at least this policy was maybe not the factor explaining their political success, but a factor explaining their political success. So going back to peace, you find it in the political platform, like the 2014 platform before the victorious elections, which gave them the presidency and the parliament in Poland, but also the most recent programmatic document I found, which is a letter of Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński to the members of followers of the Peace Party from June 2020. And he devotes a whole paragraph to the question of the memory policy. And he lists it together with the economic policy, foreign and security policy, and then he lists polityka historyczna, the history policy, as something really among the top priorities of his party, which he explains that this is necessary to build the sentiment of patriotism, of community, and the self-confidence of Poles. So we have a very positive, psychologically positive program for building confidence, community, and patriotism. However, when you have a closer look at it, it's not always the pride and patriotism and community which is the most important in this policy. Clearly, there are some other reasons shaping this policy. And when they contradict community and pride must give up to more important priorities. Peace, the Kaczyński party is mostly known for its memory wars, public conflicts about the interpretations of the past, and especially there are two of these wars with several campaigns because they are a recurring problem. The first one they involved in which they were relatively successful, is the war about the meaning of 1989. What happened in 1989? And what was the role of individual leaders of the Solidarity movement, especially of Lech Wałęsa, who was believed up to the systematic many-year campaign of peace to be the leader of the Solidarity movement, which is no longer. Now, many people in Poland no longer believe that Lech Wałęsa was the great leader of the Solidarity movement, which may surprise you, because internationally he remains to be recognized as such person. And it shows the efficiency of a very systematic efforts of this particular party to undermine his status as a national hero. And also the meaning of 1989. Was it the glorious peaceful revolution, the beginning of the transformation of Eastern Europe and the world? Or was it a secret deal between the Reds and the pinky leftists in the opposition who sold democracy and allowed the post-communists to control national wealth in the 1990s? This is a summary of the interpretation. Second topic, which is recurrently a battlefield, is the Polish Jewish history, and especially the history of the Holocaust in Poland, the behavior of the non-Jewish Poles in the face of the Jewish tragedy during the war. It started later. For a long time, peace tried to avoid the topic and made a lot of pro-Israeli gestures, if not pro-Jewish, certainly pro-Israeli gestures. But in early 2000s, with the biggest debate on history in Poland, and that was the debate following the publication of the book Neighbors by Jan Tomasz Gross about the mass killing of the Jews in summer of 1941 in a small town of Jedwabne. That was not only the biggest public debate on the Holocaust in Poland, it was the biggest debate on the past in Poland ever. Actually bigger than the debate on 1989 or the secret agents of the Communist Security Service, which shows how important, at least how emotional the topic is. And then it seems that peace realized that there is a great potential for a backlash. And since that moment, they systematically drifted, maybe not to denialism, but to distortion. So the vision of this past they present is systematically diverging from the academic visions of the past that we as historians have developed in the last 30 years. But also peace has invested a lot of time and money in the institutions that are to shape how people imagine the past. In particular, since it began of controlling the majority in the parliament and the government and the presidency in 2015-16, it took over key institutions, and in particular, the first institution to be taken over, including the amendment to the law, was the Institute of National Remembrance, better known under its Polish acronym IPN, which is a huge institution. For this year, it has a budget of more than 500 million zloty, which is more than all other institutions dealing with recent history combined. So this is a substantial, I would say, maybe not the Ministry for the Truth, but a government agency dealing with the truth on the recent past. It took control of a couple of major museums, like the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, after a protracted legal battle. It tried to take over two other leading museums, the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk, which is a museum of the Solidarity movement. It failed. But when it failed to take over, to replace the director, take control of the institution, it established a parallel institution with the same mission and shifted funds to this new institution. So now in Gdańsk, you have two competing institutions dealing with the memory of the Solidarity. It tried the same with the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and this is how I happened to be in the middle of this battle, quite unwillingly, and trying to understand what do they want. But also regional institutions like the Silesian Museum in Katowice, its director was fired. Now she is the head of the Czech National Gallery. So she is a great museum practitioner who lost a job in Poland, got in the Czech Republic. It also established a number of new institutions. Actually, this government established more national museums than all the previous governments of Poland since the Second World War taken together, more than 20. All of them are under construction. We'll see if they will be ever constructed, but it shows the scale of ambitions and the readiness to spend money on the specific topics. It also expanded the budget of IPN dramatically in the past years. So we have a systematic development of instruments of memory policy and particular instruments of the central government memory policy. And let me stress it, because all the countries have memory policies. But the question is what kind of policies these are? Who is naming streets? Who is deciding for school curricula? Who is deciding for the access to archival documents? Who is shaping the history textbooks and so on? Also monuments, festivals, street names, murals, and new heroes invented and old heroes displaced, and Lech Wałęsa is the key case of it. As I said, it was partially effective. It's very difficult to measure memory policies, like all educational policies. It's very difficult to measure the effects of education because we never know what of the many factors contributed to this or that change. So some of the changes were successful, with some others not so much. For example, the heavy systematic investment into the so-called cursed soldiers, the post-war military anti-communist underground, whom peace had chosen as the primary object of worship as the key patriotic heroes of post-war Poland. A study a couple of years ago found that only 50% of the public recognizes who they are. And this 50% is roughly divided. 25% believe they were great Polish heroes and 25% are not sure. So after so much investment, it seems that there are limits on the memory policy, but on the other hand, there are some other successes. For me, the key success is that they have no competition in the policy field. No other political party in Poland has such a complex and systematic set of policies about the past. It seems that the PiS is the owner of the themes of the past. Others are afraid of entering it, and relatively passive, I would say. And the memory policy is important because you can easily delegitimize your opponents and vilify them as successors or even children or grandchildren of communist criminals, for example. So there are reasons to make it. And there is also an emotional background to it, which I found crucial. Namely, all these policies which I have mentioned have a very strong emotional component. They are to rise inside certain types of emotions. And Mr. Kaczyński himself was speaking about the patriotic sentiment, the feeling of self-confidence in the community. And they also speak about the heroism, the pride of Polish heroism. Second one, which is not necessarily explicitly listed, is certain pride or recognition of the innocence, and especially the innocence of the innocent Polish victims under the Nazi and then communist oppression. This is why Polish Jewish history during the war is so important, because it makes the story a little bit too complex. Like the innocent victims could have betrayed someone, and that doesn't work in a simple story. But this is the emotion of pride. And emotion of pride is used widely by all the nationalists globally since the 19th century as the key emotion to be built. But there is another emotion which is particular for the populists, and this is resentment. This is the feeling that our glorious history has not been properly recognized by some people. And even we have the enemies who want to undermine it. For example, claim that not all the Poles were saving the Jews during the war. And the third feeling is the suspicion. And the number of conspiracy theories about the past produced, for example, by the newspapers close to Kaczyński party is really staggering. And they invent new ones. Why? I believe because it sells. Especially it sells with the new kind of media, the social media. When you reveal a hidden truth, you offer something which many people want to learn. And there is another aspect of it, which is so-called ontological security, an idea which I'm not sure I understand, but the political scientists who invented it claim that there is something like a set of narrative giving a stable identity to large populations, especially people who believe they belong to a nation. The basis of it are a set of narratives. So it seems to me that peace is not only proposing a stable and glorious set of Polish past, who we are. We are the children and grandchildren of the heroic Polish rebels in the Warsaw Rising of 1944. We are the grandchildren of those who opposed the communist regime in the late 1940s and so on. We are the children and heirs of the prisoners of Auschwitz and so on. It seems to me that from time to time, they deliberately produce ontological insecurity, claiming that there are people who want to deprive us of this past we deserve. That there is a past we deserve, very much as the poorer Poles deserve a generous welfare state, which the previous liberal government was denying to them, and that was a part of the narrative. It's like the Poland deserve a place in the European order, much better place than we have now, and the government is working hard to achieve it by, for example, being aggressive towards our neighbors. So it seems that the crises of ontological security, which are recurring from time to time, are not incidental, because they help. They help identify the enemy. So as a historian, let me show you kind of the genealogy of this story. So first, it seems that the key is a statement by Andrzej Paczkowski, my colleague historian, who said that the present Polish wars on the past, this is not the first war, this is the second war on the past. The original war on the past was in the 1980s, and that was the war between the Solidarity opposition movement and the Communist Party. And the Solidarity won this war, which was an important factor delegitimizing the communist rule in Poland. A significant part of the underground publishing is about historical topics, like the Katyn massacre, which was a public taboo, and just forcing the communists to speak about it was one of the big battles of the 1980s. So we had a memory war, which was effective. And what is interesting, that was a formative experience of people like Mr. Kaczyński in that time. I think this is why they can continue. And they use it in a very similar way to delegitimize the present opponents and also the nature of the regime in Poland. Second, after 1989, we have the eruption of the mass memory activism, which is pluralism, bottom-up, grassroots, for example, expressed in the thousands of street names or the patron names of school changed from various communist heroes into usually more patriotic Polish nationalist patriotic. As I said, bottom-up and pluralist. What is interesting, PiS has been accusing the governments of the Poland of 1990s of passivity or neglect or deliberate neglect of the memory policy, which is nonsense when you look at how much things changed in the memory landscapes of Poland. But that was not the job of the central government. It was much more decentralized. It was the follow-up of the 1990s when Solidarity movement, which was a network, not a unitary movement. Lech Wałęsa was a symbolic leader rather than the actual leader, having any powers on this movement. So this pluralist undermining continued in the 1990s. And then, for me, the first sign of a change of the tide was the establishment of the Institute of National Remembrance in late 1990s. It became operative in the early 2000s, but it was legislated in the late 1990s. Why I believe it to be the change of the tide? Because it didn't follow the logic of a dispersed pluralist bottom-up movement to change the way of thinking about the past. It was a state agency to deal with the past. It was a step against the logic of de-etatization and decentralization, which dominated Poland in the 1990s, towards etatization. So a logic which dominated the communist period. When you have a problem, you establish a ministry. This is the logic, basically. And it was applied to the past in the Poland of 1990s. An important factor in the 1990s was that most of the 1990s, Poland continued the transformation under the rule of the post-communist party, turned social democratic party. It continued the pro-capitalist, pro-market, pro-NATO, pro-EU reforms, but it was rather, I would say, maybe not agnostic, but abnegationist about the past. It wanted to stress it contributed to the great changes of 1989 as a side in the contract, but had good reasons not to deal too much with recent history of Poland. But it produced a backlash among the former activists of the Solidarity movement, the real fear that the communists are coming back and they control the government, and we must do something about it. One of the reasons to establish IPN was to finally kill the dead body of communist Poland in its grave, so it can never recover and return. So it was believed that this dead body of communist Poland was not fully dead. Actually, a colleague of mine, Piotr Osenka, called it the zombification, certain perpetuation, for example, of secret agents of the Communist Security Service. They are no longer, they are too old to be harmful, but their existence is perpetuated because they are the perfect enemy and perfect threat to Poland's independence. So we have this backlash. And when I use the term backlash, it immediately, I have used it already speaking about the debates on the Polish Jewish past and the Holocaust in the early 2000s, this debate. Unexpectedly, the first big project that IPN was involved in was responding to the publication of the book on Jedwabne in early 2000s. And it did it, I would say, very well. We have 2 volumes of very solid scholarship and documents. It was a very serious response. But at the same time, the big debate produced a backlash. Many people not ready to accept it and being increasingly aggressive. And this, let me add, was the best known case of something which could threaten the ontological security of many Poles, namely the growing number of minority groups becoming assertive, not only in terms of Jewish history, but also the story of the expulsion of Germans from Poland after the Second World War and the many brutalities that happened. The story of the deportation of Ukrainians in post-war Poland. The new assertiveness of the sexual minorities. Many minorities suddenly became visible in the public sphere. And that was a source of certain anxiety of people who got used to Poland, which was much more homogeneous. And it was much more clear who is the owner of it, Roman Catholic white Poles. So I think that the backlash against the debate on Jedwabne was a part of the general anxiety, this undermining of the ontological security of who we really are. Are we good people? Should be. And one more factor, which is in early 2000s, Warsaw opened the Warsaw Rising Museum, the Museum of the Warsaw Rising of 1944. It was the first history museum opened after 1989. In the 1990s, there was very little investment in culture. These were difficult times. No government had enough money to invest. And only in the early 2000s, this museum was opened when the mayor of Warsaw was Lech Kaczyński, the brother, twin brother of Jarosław Kaczyński, who was different to Jarosław Astreset. He was a nice guy, actually, nicer than his brother. And it was overdue, of course, but this museum proved to be a great success. And I think this is the moment when politicians realize that investing in museums pays off. You actually win elections. So it's relatively cheap to make a museum if you can win 100,000 votes in a 1.5 million city at that time. And I think this started a massive, what we call in Poland now the museum boom. More than 1,000 museums have been opened in Poland since 1989. And many old museums have been expanded or completely remade. And these are mostly established by private entities and the local governments. But as I said, the peace government itself established some 20 new national museums, history museums, and at least 2 museums of the cursed soldiers. And they plan to open at least 2 or 3 museums of the Polish rescuers of the Jews. These are the favorite topics. How much time do I have? Oh, okay, good. So I think this history explained the reasons why this party has invested so much intellectual effort, money, and people into this field. It's rational. It builds certain emotions which are very useful in politics, especially this kind of politics. Moreover, something happened about 2010, which changed the conditions for any public debate in Poland, the debates on history included, but not only. And this is the shift of the public debate from the printed media to the social media. Facebook Poland opened in 2008, and within 2 or 3 years, it gathered massive public. And afterwards, most of the debates following this moment shifted from dailies and weeklies, as they were in the early 2000s and 1990s, into the social media. And it's very clear that in the social media, the parties of the right were much more skillful. And my working hypothesis is as follows. They didn't have their own traditional media. They had a weak press. They didn't have the skills to sell the newspapers. They tried. And they didn't have TV channels. They always complained that the liberals control mass media. This is why I believe they invested in the new kind of media, and they had an advantage. They were the first to make it, and especially the extreme right, which proved very effective in the social media. So I think maybe this is not a watershed, but it essentially changes conditions of public debates on any topic and the public debates on the past in particular. Why? Because the algorithms of the social media favor highly emotional, controversial, divisive content. It's difficult to attack with the social media. It's easy to attack someone with the social media, to disrupt things. I think disruption, a kind of very neoliberal term, but when you apply it to memory policy, it fits very well. And you have an instrument. So with this baggage, with this set of skills and instruments, PiS won the elections in 2015 and has been ruling since this time. As I said, investing a lot in various institutions, but also there is a tendency inside the party, which I was watching and trying to understand. The first one was, and remains, a radicalization. That means things that were acceptable in 2016 were no longer acceptable in 2018. For example, me, right? I was okay to welcome President Duda and guide him through the Polin Museum. And at the end, he's standing in front of the cameras. He said, every young Pole should visit this museum. I was happy. You know, if you cannot expect more from a politician, right? But a year later, no. So something happened inside, and we see it with a number of topics. And I believe this is it's just a very working hypothesis because I have no instrument to dig into the party. This is the inner competition of various party factions. For example, who is more patriotic? You compete, which pushes you to the extreme, which makes you more radical. Second, a tendency to externalize the source of problems. If you are great, you cannot make mistakes. All the problems are coming from outside. Why? Why we are failing in this and that policy? Because we have enemies who are opposing it. So we must marginalize, destroy them, do something with them. So this tendency to externalize the evil, especially invent, design the opponents that hinder, it's also the policy by peace is also very Schmittian, with a tendency of defining the enemy as the first step of making politics. Much less inclination to find out allies, if possible at all. But with defining the enemy, very skillful. So a set of these factors was making the memory policy of the populist party increasingly aggressive. And let me quote from a recently leaked email to the Prime Minister in early 2018 by a person influential close to the ruling party, who wrote that the enemies of the nation control the key institutions of Polish Jewish history, like the Jewish Historical Institute, Polin Museum, and the Center for Holocaust Research. I was one of them. So I learned that I am the enemy of the nation, not just the enemy of a party, a critique or someone, just the enemy of the nation. So you see this radicalization of the rhetoric. It's not enough to disagree with someone. It's not enough to believe that he is wrong or counterproductive something. He or she must be the enemy. Of course, you cannot radicalize indefinitely. Radicalization has a tendency that must have a limit, always, right? Because you over-radicalize and lose a group of your supporters, or you can exhaust completely in the battles you have opened in many fields. This seems to be the main problem of the ruling party. So my explanation of these features of the policy, which I have just presented, is historical. I think it's a consequence of coincidences, that there were things happening coincidentally at that time, which contributed to this shape and to the effectiveness of this shape of the policy. First, as I said, was a tendency for re-etatization. Somewhere, and I think this is a much broader change from something which in the economy was neoliberal, in the civil society was exactly anti-communist, against the highly centralized and omnipotent government. That was the main lesson which Polish intellectuals and Polish political leaders, including the social democrats, the post-communists, which they derived from the late communist period in Poland, into re-etatization, into again the belief that there is a role and the necessity for a more proactive role of the government in anything. Second, as I said, the coincident rise of the assertive minorities of all kinds, and also the moralistic memory policy of the progressive left. We should talk about the Polish Jewish past. We should talk about the expulsion of the Germans. We should reconcile with the Ukrainians whom we deported in 1947 and so on. Another thing which happened in the 1990s, I didn't mention it. Again, this is just my supposition, that in the 1990s, Poland lost the Second World War. Up to 1989, Poland won the Second World War. I remember as a child in the school, in every textbook, there was a photograph of a Polish soldier with the Polish flag on the Brandenburg Gate, together with the Soviet soldiers in May 1945. It was clear, we won the Second World War. And in the 1990s, it turned out that we didn't, that there was a second occupation, that we lost it. We lost territory, we lost independence, we lost everything to the Soviets and the Communist Party, and it left a void. So what we can be proud of, if we are just the victims of the Second World War, not the winners of the Second World, not the heroic winners. Well, when you are a victim, the last thing you defend is your innocence. This is the last asset that a victim has, to remain innocent. This is why this debate on the Holocaust was so important. Second, in early 2000s, the great future-oriented program of return to Europe or return to normalcy was exhausted. Yes, we joined the European Union, we joined NATO, so what? It wasn't a paradise that was expected by many, at least not the paradise that people paid so much price in the difficult transformation period of the 1990s. So it was exhausted and wasn't replaced with any other future-oriented program. And then peace came with the retrotopia, to use Zygmunt Bauman term, a vision of the past that is great. Okay, it was not to make Poland great again, but to make our past great again. The new media, as I said, divisive, emotional, suspicious. They like these emotions. There is a kind of an objective alliance between these emotions and the policies of the past by peace. And one more, and I'm not implying there is kind of secret agreement between Mr. Putin and Mr. Kaczynski. I don't think so. But there are some striking similarities between the memory policies of Russia and the populist party. In the terms of the emotions, the unrecognized heroism, unrecognized sacrifice and suffering, the feeling of resentment, the tendency of government control of the messages about the past, not as dramatic as they are. So there is something which is not specifically Polish. I think it applies to other countries too. How was the relation between them? I have no idea. But this anti-modernist, retrotopic tendency to find justification for the present policies, not in the promised future, not in the future we imagined and promised, but in a past that we are the heirs of, I think was a general shift. And finally, a general shift in memory policies from the conciliatory, peace-oriented, I mean, not peace, the Kaczynski party, but much of the memory policies in the 1990s was to reconcile the past tensions between ethnic groups and nations, like the Polish-German relations, Polish-Ukrainian, Polish-Jewish relations, Polish-Lithuanian, Polish-Russian relations. Sometime in the early 2000s, in many places, actors shifted to more aggressive and belligerent policies. That means rather inciting into conflict than building reconciliation and a peaceful future. I don't know why, but it happens that a number of actors decided to choose that this is a better strategy than to work for peace at that time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for this insightful talk. I think it helped us to order a lot of discourses and a lot of things we are thinking about. So we will discuss it later. I think there are a lot of questions and comments. And now we go on to the next co-presentation of Jelena Đureinović, who is the scientific coordinator of the research platform Transformations in Eastern Europe at the University of Vienna, who is the co-host of this event. And Jelena is a historian interested in memory politics and memory cultures in the 20th and 21st century. She holds a PhD in history from Justus Liebig University in Gießen, and her main research interests include memory studies, the history of Yugoslavia, and post-Yugoslav space. Her book, The Politics of Memory of the Second World War in Contemporary Serbia, Collaboration, Resistance, and Retribution, was published with Routledge in 2020. Jelena is also member of the Executive Committee of the Memory Studies Association, and we are very happy to hear your talk, Jelena.
Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you for such a nice introduction. Listening to the previous presentation, I was just thinking about all the transnational and global patterns of populism and memory politics, and how with all regional and national and local specificities, including Poland and Serbia, and all the differences of the historical experience of state socialism and its collapse, we still have these patterns such as the unrecognized victimhood, unrecognized heroism, memory politics, official memory politics based on emotions, and so on. But I will try to outline some characteristics of post-socialist transformations of memory politics in Serbia, and also but focus there mostly on the relationship between populism and memory politics, which means the current regime of the Serbian Progressive Party, which has been in power since 2012, but actually has been in state institutions since the early 90s. And if we speak of these broader trends and patterns in the Serbian case, we can recognize two main patterns or two main prisms of historical interpretations. And that's first anti-communism, and then second, ethnicization of the past, basically meaning that everything is looked through this prism of the ethnic community and of the Serbian nation. And I will speak about that in more detail a bit later. If both of these, of course, reflect the broader trends in Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe and are not unique to Serbia, but some things also, of course, are. And when it comes to anti-communism, this was the dominant framework of historical interpretation after the fall of Slobodan Milošević in 2000. Which meant where all political elites, political actors who came to power in this very heterogeneous democratic coalition that came to power, were trying to basically kill the zombie of the dead body of communism very hard. And that included criminalization of everything related to socialist Yugoslavia, radical revision of the Second World War, of course, as the birthplace and source of legitimacy of socialist Yugoslavia, where, of course, the defeated forces, the collaborators became heroes, and then the Yugoslav partisans, of course, became perpetrators, looking at them through the very narrow lens of the post-war retribution. And this was fitting the general anti-totalitarian paradigm that was present, of course, that has been present across the post-socialist space. But in Serbia, it came into the official narratives, into the official state-sponsored memory politics only in 2000, and was, as I said, very dominant. It was, we can talk about it maybe a bit later during the discussion. And of course, if we look at the fall of communism, the end of socialist Yugoslavia in the Serbian case, or in the Yugoslav case, of course, the fall of communism was followed by a series of armed conflicts, by the breakup of the state. And in this period after 2000, there was basically no political will to deal with these legacies, but rather the focus was on just the Second World War and the socialist Yugoslavia, both observed through this lens of the post-war period, post-war trials and executions. And then what I would call the authoritarian or the populist turn in memory politics happened in 2012, or a bit later after the Serbian Progressive Party came to power. And here the 90s wars actually became the focal point of official memory politics, where the role of Serbia was not something unpleasant to talk about, but actually something to be celebrated. And here we have, of course, war criminals celebrated as heroes, genocide denial as state policy, mourning for the Serbian victims only, of course, and embracing simply this nationalist, denialist, and simplistic interpretation of the wars. And if we look at the post-Yugoslav space in general, we will, of course, see that all political elites tend to commemorate only their own victims, and they tend to present their armed forces from the 90s wars as the defenders of the nation. This is not unique to Serbia. But then when it comes to the Second World War, what I find particularly interested in this populist memory politics of the Serbian regime is that the People's Liberation War, so the communist-led partisans, the parallel socialist revolution, becomes appropriated by right-wing nationalists and even the far right as a Serbian army that brought freedom and liberation to former Yugoslavia, but also to Europe, if we look at them together with the Red Army. And here, of course, if we want to have the partisans as the Serbian army celebrated, they can't be Yugoslav anymore, they can't be communist anymore, and they can't be revolutionary. So what is left is just a very military narrative of a very heroic Serbian army that was victorious against fascism. And here, memory diplomacy with Russia is very important in this commemorative context, but this is also something that we can talk about later in more detail. And what happens if we observe some of the practices of the official memory politics and policies today in Serbia, we can see that the government is investing serious efforts in memory politics, probably unprecedented, but not in museums, interestingly, which are underfunded, and there are not many new museums opening. But however, we have media, use of social media, use of multimedia, we have massive cultural production, and of course, serious efforts invested into silencing the opposing views, and where we have also very aggressive narratives that are often directed at neighboring states, such as Croatia, where they talk about how no one will humiliate Serbia ever again. And here, what I found very interesting, studying history of memory or history of memory politics and memory culture in Yugoslavia and the post-Yugoslav space, is the awareness and openness about doing memory politics, where normally studying, doing memory studies, you rarely see memory actors saying openly, we are doing memory politics, using this word. This is a scholarly concept. This is not a word that you will hear. However, in the Serbian case, and what I found very often in speeches and media discourses, is that the state actors say, we are now working on building a new memory culture, a different memory culture. We are returning the pride to the Serbian nation. And that's something that I found particularly interesting. And maybe now I would look at it a bit more broadly, the characteristics of populist memory politics in Serbia, but to try to kind of outline the main characteristic, because of course, memory politics is always populist at its core. It always aims at least to be populist. However, in this context, when we are talking about contemporary right-wing and nationalist populism, it is, of course, it has some specificities. And of course, here the state power is more emphasized. And as I already said, the efforts to silence critical views are more emphasized. There are more resources that are invested in memory politics, including in the case of Serbia, traveling commemorations that go to different places to reach every local community and beyond the capital city, but also live streaming on YouTube of commemorations, which is for us as researchers, of course, really interesting, because we get to transcribe these speeches and have them, and they are there on YouTube, they stay there. And it is television, of course, in prime time. That's why commemorations now take place at 8 p.m. and not at noon. And of course, every populist claims to represent the people, and every populist has some kind of idea about who these people are and what the people are, and some kind of truth as well, against some kind of elites. These are all constructed concepts that are different in every context. In the case of Serbia, the elites are all the previous governments who didn't allow the Serbian people to be proud of their past, and they are usually, and intellectuals, of course, and which is very typical for populism. And what I already mentioned is this kind of mixed bag of very incompatible ideological and historical elements that are incoherent and merged together, which is why I mentioned the far right, for example, celebrating the victory against fascism. So here we have the far right participating at the Immortal Regiment procession, which is imported in Serbia, of course, to celebrate the victory against fascism and communist partisans. And then we have war criminals, sentenced war criminals from the ICTY from the 90s, leading these processions that celebrate again the victory against fascism in the Second World War. And here, what binds all these incompatible elements together is the concept of liberation wars of Serbia, which is now in the state program of commemorations and all other relevant documents. It is used in speeches as well. And basically, it is liberation war, usually was the People's Liberation War, Narodno-oslobodilačka borba. Now these liberation wars in plural involve anti-Ottoman uprisings, the Balkan Wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and then the 90s, particularly the war in Kosovo. And when you merge them all together and then celebrate them on the 9th of May, of course, the Serbian army then becomes the eternal defender and never on the wrong side, never. If it's a liberation war, that means that you're not attacking anyone, you're defending yourself and so on. And here I would just finish with a brief comment of what this all means, this kind of industry of memory and these kinds of narratives for memory activism, and for how, what it means for people who are trying to fight revisionism in Serbia. I think in the period after 2000 and in the 90s, the biggest challenge was that the 90s wars were not present in the public, and that everyone had to, that these activists and civil society had to fight to document human rights violations, but then also to talk about memory of it, to fight against denial and so on. And now the 90s wars are everywhere. There are high budget, really great made movies that are shown on national television. For the first time, they are available on internet, which is usually not the case. You can't actually access them online, Serbian movies. And now, because they have government funding, they are on YouTube and they have millions of views. We have these massive commemorations that travel across country where more than 10,000 people attend, and it is difficult to come against that with any kind of narrative, with your own small protest or commemoration and so on, and be visible anywhere, especially that most of activities against the official memory politics take place in Belgrade, and they don't reach anyone beyond Belgrade. And these state commemorations do, because they do travel around like a circus in a way. And I think, and Dariusz talked about also the question of success of populist memory politics. And here, in the case of Serbia, I think it's not only the traveling, of course, that's successful, but also, unlike many other initiatives before, and there were so many, especially when we are talking about the 90s wars, the official memory politics, the dominant narratives successfully integrate the experience of the 90s of the people in Serbia, which is why it is not accidentally that the focus is on 99, because almost everyone in Serbia remembers the NATO bombing. And almost everyone also remembers the other focal point of the official memory politics, which is the 95 Operation Storm, when hundreds of thousands of refugees came to Serbia. And that was also something that was visible for most of people. So they focus on purpose on particularly these events that people have some kind of memory of, and they use them in a very successful way. And of course, when you mix that with emotions, with politics of emotions, and the narratives of pride and resentment, and finally returning the pride to the nation and allowing them to be proud of their armed forces, who are not war criminals, but heroes, this becomes something that many people will accept. And we can see that, especially when it comes to young people, when it comes to various subcultures. We can see that on the walls across Serbia, where various units from the 99 war in Kosovo are celebrated there on T-shirts and so on. We can really see that this official memory policy travels very well, unfortunately. I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Jelena. I think both talks had a lot of connections, and we are kind of, I mean, yeah, we still have time, but I don't know. I won't have so many questions, but I have some. because I found it very interesting that you both were speaking somehow about this awareness of doing memory politics. And also Professor Stola was talking about this effectiveness of this politics, and also that the other parties are passive and somehow cannot do anything on this. And when we talk not only about the past, but also about the future, I would have the question, and this is something Jelena started to talk about, is there a way to overcome this not only political, but also somehow psychological vicious circle of this memory politics and policies? And also when it comes to emotions, I think like that the antagonist of pride is shame. What would you say, what kind of role does shame play in it? And also my last question, also connected to contemporaneity, did the Russian invasion in Ukraine in February 2022 change somehow this this politics of memory from these populist parties, or did it not? Thank you.
About shame, I didn't mention that one of the key words, key slogans in the propaganda of the populist party was how they struggle against the pedagogy of shame. They accuse the opponents of having a deliberate, systematic program of shaming the Polish nation. Because speaking of, like things like the bad behavior towards the Jews during the Second World War, that was to bring, which was nonsense. I don't know anyone who wanted to impose this, maybe someone, but I don't know these people. But again, it plays very well with the feeling of resentment and also identifying the enemies, that there are the people who want you to feel ashamed, and we want you to be proud. We want you to be really proud of the past. A very useful way of defining your position and the position of your enemy. If you ask about how we can we change about anything, well, first, I would say if we don't start doing, we will not change it. And there is a visible discrepancy between this discrepancy is the perfect way of showing that the elites is alienated. The essence of the populism is defining the corrupted elite against the good people. And you have a topic such as heroism or innocence. You find out that academics think differently than ordinary people about it. And so this is the opportunity to write. If I was to give the single most effective change that would change the conditions for it, I would say yes. Call your American friends to somehow influence the nice people in Palo Alto, California, to change the algorithms of the social media. They can make it in the afternoon, and 3 months later on, you will have green political parties, feminist parties winning elections in Eastern Europe. Maybe I exaggerate a little bit, but this is the single, if I was to identify this one factor, which is most powerful and also possible to change, because humans made it so humans can change it. Well, they will lose, they will not earn $5 billion quarterly, but 4.5. So this is the one thing which I would advise to do. You can say that this is the cheap way of justifying your own passivity. Now, I think that academics have some things to do, and this is developing public history. That means a way of talking about the past which is understandable. But when the playing field is not, you don't have a level playing field. This game, especially in the social media, is not. You will play up the hill with the ball, but still there are things we can do.
When it comes to shame, I think a great example for how important it is that almost every commemorative speech in Serbia since 2012 or 2014 has this sentence, we are returning the pride to the Serbian nation. This is really something that is said openly. So I think I don't have to add anything to that. When it comes to how to fight this, that big question, I think I work together with one human rights organization from Belgrade, Humanitarian Law Center, that has worked since '92 on documenting the human rights violations, and now also has a memory program and works on fighting the dominant narratives. The approach was always to point out to the crimes committed by the Serbian forces and to the non-Serbian victims. And this doesn't travel well in society. And there have been, I think the civil society has tried everything. There have been all sorts of projects where you meet in a summer school where you have 5 people from each former Yugoslav republic, and they all come together to reconcile and so on. I myself have been part of such programs as well. And I think everyone forgets that if we move away from the perpetrators, victims, crimes, and so on, and look at socioeconomic injustice, the socioeconomic aspects of the 90s wars, as the most recent problematic past in the case of Serbia, that's where people could probably understand each other a bit better, because in Serbia, of course, you don't live next door to members of other ethnic groups who have maybe been part of armed forces, but in Bosnia you do, and across the post-Yugoslav space, all dominant war narratives in every ethnic group are very divisive. So moving away from these military issues and issues of guilt, responsibility, and victimhood, and looking at these very real experiences of the 90s that were very real for everyone in all these countries would be a starting point, and not bringing 5 people from every country together to come up with some kind of poster, or I don't know, but rather really moving this discussion in that direction is for me the only thing that no one has tried, and that maybe could have some effects at least at a local level.